Cool, guys. Hope everyone's having a good week. Thank you for joining. The topic we're keen to discuss today is obviously quite broad, the planning of a software project, particularly for business leaders. So we're going to try cover quite a lot. We are hoping to include a Q&A section at the end. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to type in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. Or you're obviously very welcome to message either myself or Chris on LinkedIn after the webinar. And we're happy to go into a bit of detail and define things because we're going to be touching on a lot of topics. But the purpose of today's session is to really give a mental framework that at least we would suggest you use when approaching the planning of a software project, and to share specific insights that we found over the last years of kind of building web applications as a software development house that impact costs and scale and performance and all those types of important things. So yeah, I'd like to hand over to Chris, who'll be leading today. And I think we're going to start at a kind of holistic picture and start to move more into the detail of what it means to plan a software project.
Good stuff. Thanks, Robbie, for the good intro. Yeah, as Robbie says, please feel free in the Q&A section or in the chat to ask any questions you might have. We feel that, asking the questions as we go along is better than kind of waiting until the end and then having to ask these questions. So please feel free. We will try to respond in the chat. Otherwise, if there are any pretty solid questions, we'll handle them right at the end. Thanks again for your time and for joining. I think this is, as Robbie says, a very, very big topic, how to plan a software project. And I think we can talk hours about this, but we're going to start by kind of doing a 30,000 feet flyover, talking about this topic and trying to cover, as many valuable things as possible. And we're also planning on uploading this to YouTube and LinkedIn afterwards. So if you want to give it a rewatch, that will be entirely possible. So without further ado, let's kick off with the first topic. So we have kind of broken this down into various subtopics. So I'm going to start with defining the vision of the software project. So the first question we got to ask ourselves is, what is the purpose of this project? And here we find it valuable to say, what role does the software play in the business strategy? The reason we look at this is because if the software is just a to-do list item, it's on somebody's list, or somebody thinks this might be valuable, or it's solving a little problem in the business, then the software doesn't have a very big purpose. But we believe that in businesses, you can solve bottlenecks with software very effectively today. So we want to look at what is the role of the software, and specifically related to the business strategy, and how can we resolve bottlenecks to really make the business flow better and more profitable. So asking this question kind of leads into the following types of, I would say, sub-questions that need to be understood. I would say the first one is, are you going to sell this software as a product? So are you building internal software for your team to manage a project, or are you building external facing software, a SaaS product or something? And what is the goal of the software? So is it a dashboard to map analytics, or maybe, a shipping or traveling system, or is it a product that people are going to use as a SaaS or a PaaS solution? That's very important. What is the, how are you going to sell this software? And then the next thing I would say is, if you're planning on building a business, a software business, you have to define the goals for yourself and for your business. So the reason this is important is, if you're building software, there's a lot of stuff, and we'll get into intellectual property and a few things later on, that can really give your business a higher price equity ratio. So, and the kind of software you build to construct this business and sell the business as a whole makes a massive impact. Then we need to look at the end users, who they are and how they're involved in this process. Because when we're building the software to solve their problems, instead of building software and looking for problems in the market, we need to identify problems in the market and build software to solve those problems. And how do we involve those users, and how do we validate that we are indeed solving their problem? Because we often see that you think people have this problem, you build a solution, nobody wants it, or they have the problem, you build a solution, nobody wants it. So you want to go to them with that solution, validate that they have that problem and how you're solving it for them. The next thing we need to look at is the long-term requirements, so the expansion and scalability of the software. The reason we thought this topic is very interesting is because everybody is currently talking about microservices and splitting up the architecture and building it out in a very big kind of, let's put something on AWS, let's put something on Google Cloud, let's put something on Azure, and we're going to build this massive architecture because we're going to have 10,000 or 100,000 users, and you end up having 50 or 100 users. So don't overcomplicate the architecture from the start. Yes, you're going to build software that's inevitably going to run into scaling problems, and there are various ways of solving those. But what are those long-term requirements? And are you going to serve 150 customers? Are you going to serve hundreds of thousands of customers? And also, what is the likelihood that you're actually going to reach those people and sell to them? So we need to look at those long-term requirements. The next thing we'll look at in terms of defining the project vision is how, or kind of what I've just said relates to how we think about the following things. So the first thing is technical debt. So the decisions we make today, how does that impact the software in the future? So in other words, let's just say you want to buy a television set today, you don't have the money, you swipe the credit card, you make debt. So in software, we can relate that to making poor decisions right now, to rapidly deploy features to get the managers happy, but we have to pay that debt in future. The other thing we need to think about is ownership and intellectual property. When we're building software, especially web software, there's a lot of packages and a lot of libraries out there that are open source that we can use in our software. We have to remember, though, that they're licensed mostly under MIT, which means they don't belong to us. Although they do permit us to sell them on an enterprise level, that all really depends on the kind of license. We have to remember that the intellectual property of the software is not ours, it's open source. And therefore, if an investor looks at this product or business, that is going to really impact how they feel about the software. So we have to really keep that in mind. Then we look at data ownership. So who owns the data? If you're using Shopify, for instance, Shopify actually owns your data, because without their platform, the data means nothing. Yes, you can export to Excel and those kind of platforms, but really think about the data ownership and your ability not to be vendor locked in, but to actually get out. Then we'll look at the tooling selection. We'll get more into exactly what we mean by tooling a bit later, but that is very important. And then the last thing under what we think about in the vision of the software product is the internal versus external use and how that changes the requirements. So if you're building software for external facing customers, that is very different to internal facing customers. Now, just a little caveat in this, a lot of people say, well, it's for my colleagues, it's internal use, we don't really care about their experience, and that's not too important to us. But it can really build a very, very strong relationship if you see your colleagues, your internal customers, as customers as well, and you want them to be satisfied. If you handle them like that, you'll have a far better working environment and experience, and they'll also be respectful of your methodology and way of working, which will really enhance this product. Right, moving on to the next and last topic of this specific section, so defining the project vision, we'll talk a bit about how the software impacts the following things, or what kind of impact the software has on society. Does the software impact the lives of people? So are we building mining, first responder, dispatch kind of software here, or are we just building a nice to have product? Now, we want to build stuff that people want, not that they must have. They must want whatever you're building. But does lives depend on this? Because that's really important. If you're defining the vision, you're going to have legislation, you're going to have many different things that are going to be important here. Then we've touched on the daily users. How many will you really have? And then your ability to do data migration from where you're at now to maybe a future release, because we're going to end up rebuilding much of the software we built today in any case. And then we need to think about the revenue that the software is going to generate for the business, and also the value to the business, because the software is always very valuable. Well, maybe the business doesn't always see that, but it can be very valuable. So in terms of defining the project vision, I would say that's a kind of very high level overview that I can give people over there, and just with a few pointers and tips to look at when you're doing that. Robbie, over to you.
Yeah, perfect. I think, as discussed, it's a huge topic, but I think the main point that I would just try to repeat is that At the end of the day, we're trying to anchor the decisions that are made on the software project front within actually a level of business strategy. And I feel like we see that often underestimated. And then the second thing is that Chris has already touched on, the aspects of tooling and IP. We also see repeatedly underestimated or even ignored completely. And that can really bite you 2, 3, 5 years down the line. I'd like for us to dive a little bit deeper into actually the process or the framework of defining scope and complexity of a project. So as we're approaching and we're getting started, how are we actually, navigating decisions like, are we selecting certain tooling? Is this going to be a bespoke, custom build? What methodology are we using to manage the project? All those types of decisions that really impact the success of the entire project.
Thanks, Robbie. Yeah, so I think let's talk a bit about defining the scope and the complexity. So here I'm going to talk about 5 things that I think are very helpful. So the first thing we look at is the type of build. Is this software bespoke? Is it custom? Or are we building for existing tooling? This has a massive impact. Are we building a CRM from scratch? Or are we building modules for Salesforce or Microsoft CRM? Are we building an e-commerce platform from scratch, or are we building, plugins for Shopify or Magento or BigCommerce or those kind of platforms? And this has a massive impact. And I've seen that people sometimes build stuff bespoke and custom when that's not really needed. And if you ask them why they did it, they don't have a good reason. So for instance, if you're going to build an e-commerce business with a very unique angle, such as Takealot, then it makes sense why you're going to build that software custom or bespoke. But if you're building the next drop shipping business, then use BigCommerce unless you have a very good reason about intellectual property or the kind of PE ratio you're looking for if you want to sell the business, or maybe it doesn't fit your business needs. I think often there is existing software you can build on top of for these kind of things. So that's pretty important. First thing is the type of build we're looking at, custom, bespoke, or existing. The next thing we'll look at is the methodology that we're going to use. And here I just want to say that people often say Scrum and Agile methodologies, but Agile is a mindset and Scrum is just a specific framework to implement that mindset. So it helps us to be Agile. And we have to look at what kind of mindset and methodology and framework we're going to be using when we're building the software, because there are certain products, for instance, where you have to follow waterfall. So to give you an example, when Google's building a massive new algorithm or a machine learning, where they have to do years of mathematics or modeling before they can even start, you can't be Agile with that. I mean, no use in checking in with those guys daily or just frustrate them a lot. So that is waterfall. But I think a lot of projects can be Agile, and you can use Scrum, and companies don't always, although they think they are, they're using the terminology, but they're not really following those frameworks. So I think that's pretty important. Then in terms of methodology, I would also just say this: prioritize user stories over long requirement documents. So don't let the business come to you and give you a 40-page document with requirements. Rather, focus on the value and the problems they're solving and writing those stories from the perspective of the users that they're solving it for. Because when the developers then tackle the problem, instead of building what the business tells them, they're looking at the problem that the user has and they're looking at the best way of solving that. And then kind of linking to that, it helps us to prioritize the value. Because if people are just giving us requirements, then we don't know why and what is valuable to them. However, if they give us problems, bottlenecks, and we can solve those, we know what the value is to the business, and therefore we can prioritize that first. So for instance, if 80% of users are asking for a new payment method, that is very valuable to the business and it can increase the conversion rate. So we'll prioritize that first, not urgent stuff or people asking for it the most, but the most business value. The next thing, the third point I'll look at in terms of defining the scope and complexity of your software project is documentation. So earlier I said don't have long documents, but there are certain software systems, for instance, workflow with insurance companies, where business processes need to be defined and laid out in BPMN or logic flows. So do those exist? And have they been documented? To what extent have they been kept up to date? If they don't exist, do you have access to a business analyst to analyze what you have currently or get that out of the business and then document that? The fourth thing I'll talk about is knowns versus unknowns. So if you are estimating your software, think about an X, Y axis where you have unknown and you have amount of effort on the y-axis and unknown on the x-axis, and you split this into 4 quadrants, and every piece of, or every story that your team sizes goes into one of these 4. So if you have a lot of stuff in the complex unknown quadrant of your graph, then you know you've got a problem, because there are a lot of unknowns and a lot of complexity. So the software is probably going to take more time than you're thinking. But if you, on the other side, don't have a lot of knowns, or don't have a lot of unknowns and not a lot of effort needed, then you're in a different position. So before tackling the project, if you map out that kind of diagram, that will give you very good visual representation of where you're at in terms of defining the scope. The last thing, the 5th thing I'll talk about in terms of defining the scope and complexity, is the budget and the timeline. So the budget's always unknown. We don't know what the budget is, and the timeline is yesterday. So find out why the timeline is yesterday. Why has this become so urgent? What problem, what have gone wrong previously? Has it been attempted previously? What team worked on it? What kind of issues did they have? You know, why really have we reached this point? Don't just accept the fact that the customer wants it yesterday. Really try to understand that. And then the next thing I'll say is, when we're looking at the budget of the software, what we do is, instead of looking at time and materials, we look at the business value that we're solving, and we're estimating the software according to that. And the reason we do that is we believe that if we solve bottlenecks in a business, remember, if you have a pipeline with a bottleneck, it's affecting your entire flow. So your entire flow is subject to that one bottleneck. So when you're costing what this is costing you, it's the cost of the entire business and the flow per day or per hour, not just the cost of the single bottleneck. And if you're implementing software that's solving that bottleneck, that is very valuable, and rather work according to the value that you're giving the business as opposed to the time and materials, because then you are aligning with their business needs. So that is kind of the 5 things: type of build, methodology, documentation, number of knowns and unknowns, and the budget and the timeline, that I'll really look at when defining the scope and complexity of the software project. Robbie, I think that's kind of a good summary of this section.
For sure. Agreed. And I think those are kind of the 5 silos that I think we end up looking at with any project that we've approached over the years. One thing which is recurring throughout all that and impacts the type of build, the budget, the timeline, affects, you know, what's viable with a methodology, is something we repeatedly come back, which is tooling selection, that tech stack selection. And as I said at the beginning, I think it's something we see as consistently underestimated. And often the safe bet is taken, the previously understood tech stack is just chosen because it's known, when in many cases it's actually not what's best for the project. It's something we've done a webinar on, purely on the topic of tech stack selection, and I'd like for us just to focus a bit of time on that decision because it is so important. So could you talk a bit into tooling selection, tech stack selection? What are the kind of core pillars that go into your mind as you process that decision?
Yeah, I think here I always use the analogy, and maybe it's getting a bit old for you guys now, but if you're building a house and you're building it, you know, by the coast, for instance, we're using new tech these days to build those houses because it's more robust and it doesn't have as much corrosion. It's cheaper to maintain. There are just various, you know, advantages of using that. So that those are the materials you choose to build the house. We no longer use bricks, but when we're building, you know, inland, it's fine to use bricks. Now, I'm no house building expert, but software is very similar to that. The tooling that we use to build the software is like the material we choose when we build a house or a car or anything for that matter. And each piece of material has different pros and cons and advantages and disadvantages. And just the other day, I spoke to a guy again that said, you know, he doesn't care about those things and he's a SaaS business, but it really impacts him. You know, he's experiencing constant corrosion because he chose the wrong material, and he's saying he doesn't care about it. So what we're looking at is not just, you know, tooling that everybody's using it. We're looking at tooling that's the best for the product. And we see the fact that everybody's not using our tooling as an advantage to those customers where they have, you know, an upside over other people. Because the example here is, for instance, if you look at something like React or Next.js, you know, 2 million sites are using those if you're looking at build width. you're having the same limitations and problems and bottlenecks and issues as 2 million other people. That's how we look at it, as opposed to tooling that's more unique, that's not used by as many people, giving you those core advantages. And there are actually quite cool articles and findings about this. For instance, the founder of Y Combinator in the early 90s or mid 90s, where they built VR Web. So I won't go into too much detail, but we often find that people underestimate the impact of the tooling has on their decisions. So let's just quickly touch on, because I've been saying this word tooling a lot, and just clarify what we see as tooling. So we see this as the whole technology stack. So when you're building the front end, you could use React, Elm, Svelte, those kind of frameworks and languages. When you're building the back end, you could use Express.js, Lambda, or PHP, C#, those kind of frameworks. And then when everybody needs a database, when we're looking at the database, MySQL, Microsoft SQL, Firebase, MongoDB, those document databases have become increasingly popular these days. So collectively, all of this for us forms the tooling or the technology stack. Now, what we see when people don't care about selecting these, the issues we find is, well, the first thing that comes to mind is you want to build an app, right? So where do you start? You start looking for tooling. You spend a weekend figuring out what database. You've built your structure. Now you need to select a middleware. So maybe you decide to use Rust, and you do a course on Rust, and now you connecting the two, and then you're like, okay, what are we going to use for the front end? You've heard React a lot, or maybe Gatsby or Next.js, one of these front end frameworks. So you're going to use that, and you do a bit of a course, and eventually you've got all these pieces together a week or two later, and you figured out the basics of these, but you haven't actually even started building any software, and you don't yet know the pros and cons and what that's going to cause for you in the long term. So I would say that is definitely an issue. Is also another thing is the glue encoders and decoders between all these layers that you're writing. The next issue that we see is the intellectual property and the packages. If you're using something such as JavaScript, you're going to have tons of packages and libraries that you can use in your code base, and those really impact the intellectual property of the code base. So for instance, you might spend up writing 50 or 60% of your entire code base on open source stuff. So if an investor walks in and wants to buy this business, they're going to look at that. They're going to say, what is really your intellectual property? What code is unique to your business and not open source? And what is actually open source out there for everybody? And does that really give you a unique edge? So that's very important. Another thing we see when people don't think about the tooling mindset is bit rot or code rot. Now, this is code that worked yesterday, it stopped working today. So it's always, you hear this a lot from developers. We did nothing and it broke. And the client's always like, that breaks trust with them. So the code just stops working overnight, or, it worked 6 months ago and now it's not working anymore, or there's been, various changes, and you get that kind of bit rot. Then we look at the maintainability. So how maintainable is what I build today in 6 months' time, or when another developer has to work on that? And we often find that frameworks or languages such as JavaScript is not always very maintainable. Now, you can bring in TypeScript and various things you can do, but it's almost that complexity over time graph, where over here it's quite easy, but as you move along, it just becomes infinitely more complex. And this kind of ties in nicely to the next point, which is you need to be able to pivot quickly, because if your business works, you're going to get competitors, right? And you're going to have to pivot, or Google might make API changes, or whoever you're integrating with are also moving, and you're going to have to adapt to that and pivot, or maybe the business goes in a different direction, and you have to think about your ability to do that. And if your code base becomes very complex over time, to pivot, especially when its core features, becomes very, very difficult. And tooling plays a massive role in that. Then the last thing in terms of issues we see is just the performance and how it slows down over time. So it might be very fast in the beginning, but as you go along, the system really starts slowing down quite a bit. And that's not always immediately apparent, but really becomes a problem later. So, and tooling again plays a massive role in that. So if you don't want this to happen, or if this happens to you, you're going to end up rebuilding your stack, or you're going to get to a point where, like a complete rewrite is needed. And that's just going to cost the business a lot. So, or you're not going to be able to do a rebuild. I mean, if you think about the banks, for instance, they can't just rebuild their software, or their airlines can't just rebuild their software. So, you know, and then that becomes very, very expensive to the business, the tooling, decision, and selection. So I would say, just under this section, there are a lot of technologies, a lot of competitors, you know, each have pros and cons, and really try to weigh up those pros and cons and the impact that that will have on all the above mentioned things. Robbie, over to you.
Yeah, as I think it's likely somewhat clear, I think tooling selection is a particular passion of ours, just the journey of our business over the last few years and how we've shaped that process and made certain decisions that's pushed us in a certain direction with regards to tooling selection. So that's always something we're open to chatting and having more in-depth conversations about. The last thing I'd really like for us to touch on is choosing a technical partner. And it goes without saying, it's a huge decision. If it's an internal team, that's less of a concern. But for a lot of smaller enterprises who are going out and working alongside a technical agency, there's a lot of things that go into play. So what would you kind of put as the core framework to have in mind when choosing the right technical partner?
I think what is very important is the role that this partner is going to play for you, because what we like to see ourselves at is not order takers. And why that's very important, for instance, when we're playing this technical role for somebody, is you're coming to us with a specific problem, and we're the experts in solving that problem. We don't want you to tell us how to solve the problem, because then, you know, you're doing our work for us. We need to solve that problem for you. It's like going to the doctor. I mean, you're not going to go to the doctor and tell the doctor what to do. You're going to go with symptoms. They're going to ask questions. They're going to form a diagnosis, and they're going to give you a solution to that problem. So a doctor is not an order taker, they're an expert. So if you're working with a technical partner that simply just accepts everything you say and they do everything you want to do without questioning and really educating or pushing back, you know, they're typically an order taker. And the problem with that is it's not a healthy relationship to have, because the expert needs to tell you if they're seeing that you're going in the wrong direction. So the role of the technical partner is very, very important. We look at the kind of internal versus external team dynamic. If you're working with, you know, colleagues, for instance, that's a different dynamic as opposed to working with an external company. If you're working with an external company, you have to look at the culture, whether that fits your company culture, because you can't change the external company. But if you're working with an internal team, you know, you might go to the bar.
Chris, you back?
Yeah, apologies. I have no idea what happened there. So yeah, as I was saying, so that internal versus external team dynamic, and then also two factors to consider. So track record, expertise, costs, also payment structures. So I absolutely hate it when people do the waterfall 50% upfront, 50% upon completion kind of thing, because it's just for both parties such a bad way of structuring the payment. So, you know, how is that technical partner structuring payments, and also milestones, and why are they doing it in that way? A far better way, according to my opinion, at least, is to do a kind of both parties. You know, the dev partner obviously has that advantage, but the customer also has less risk involved for them. So yeah, and then I would say tips to ensure that your relationship works is make sure they follow Agile and Scrum, because as I said earlier, for most projects, that's the best kind of mindset and framework. But really make sure that they are following it, because a lot of guys say, yeah, they do stand-ups and they do sprints and those kind of things. But when you really start querying a bit, you realize that although they're using the terminology, they're not implementing those frameworks correctly. So we need to really make sure that they are, and the way we can do that is by upskilling ourselves. So you know, get to know the terminology, maybe read a book, or maybe do a course, you know, so that you can understand what is a cumulative flow diagram, or what is velocity, or what are sprints, and what are burn up and burn down charts, and what are these things, because if you're speaking to the technical partner, that will really help you. And the last thing I'll say in this section is, if you're needing to micromanage your technical partners, something is absolutely wrong. You shouldn't be asking on a daily basis what their progress is, or what they're going to work on, what they're stuck with. The process should be designed so that it's very transparent. You know what's going on, and you need to be at any given moment, you know, go into the product backlog, see what's going on, what's being done, what still needs to be done, what are the blockers. That transparency absolutely needs to exist for this relationship to be effective. So if you're finding yourself in a position where you have to micromanage your tech partner or your developers, you need to look at some of these things. So yeah, that really sums up and summarizes the choosing tech partner side. Yeah, I've done a lot of talking. I hope the webinar has been informed. This is kind of the last section of the webinar. So yeah, I think Robbie, over to you. Let's see if there are any questions.
Sure thing. It's obviously a massive topic, so I think we've tried to cover quite a few of the bases, but there's arguably a webinar or a chat that can be had on each of these topics. The one question that is popping up from my side is from Skulk. He's just asking if we could elaborate on tool stack selection a bit. The question is, aren't all frameworks just a different tool for different jobs? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think no, that's actually a very good loaded question, but I think my answer there would be you get front-end frameworks, for instance. You get many different kinds of frameworks, and each try to solve a very specific problem in its area. But ultimately, it really depends on what you're comparing here. But I would say there are a lot of front-end frameworks or back-end frameworks that try to solve the same problem just from a different angle, and then there are a lot of them that don't. That go into very specific areas for very specific problems. So I don't think all the frameworks can be just compared with each other, but some frameworks are definitely, even if they're trying to solve the same problem, better than others. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers the question. I must say, I'm slightly struggling to understand the exact question, but that would be my take on that.
Perfect. Good stuff. There are no further questions that I think really fit the context at the moment. Yeah, I would just say once again, thank you to everyone who joined individually. Thank you, guys. I hope you found at least one or two nuggets that you feel are practical, even if it's something like, the importance of IP and how that's often, forgotten about in these kind of decision-making processes. That kind of single topic can play huge dividends if you've got a good understanding of it, and don't forget about it a few years down the line with the software project. Once again, inboxes are open. We're always keen to chat. We're very passionate about this stuff and zero obligation. We're always keen to have a conversation. So yeah, Chris, thanks for hosting and running us through all these concepts. It's a huge topic, and hopefully we did a decent job at covering everything. But yeah, that's it from my side. And Chris, anything else you'd like to add? But then I think we're good to go.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Robbie. Thanks for joining. I see some thanks coming through in the Q&A and chat section. So yeah, it's been great to host, and I hope it's been informative. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your week. It's almost weekend, and thanks for watching, and hope to see you soon.